Welcome, dear listener, to a journey back in time to the distant sands of ancient Egypt. As you settle in for a restful slumber or a moment of calm, I invite you to let your mind drift along the meandering waters of the Nile, where a civilization of wonders once flourished under the scorching sun. Before we begin our tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and share. It's always a delight to see the global community gathered for these quiet excursions into history. And if you find yourself enjoying this style of soft, lulling storytelling, subscribing would be most appreciated. It's viewers like you who keep this series of soothing historical tales gently flowing. Now, let us turn our gaze to the Egyptian landscape of long ago, to the age of pharaohs and gods, of golden sands and grand ambitions etched in stone. The pyramids, those monumental triangles rising eternally against an azure sky. For millennia, they have loomed as timeless wonders, their origins swathed in myth and mystery. But tonight, we'll delve deeper, beyond the glittering facade of these ancient marvels, to uncover the very human stories that dwell in their shadows, the lives of the tens of thousands of slaves who sweat and toil, suffering and sorrow, raised the pyramids from desert sands to towering heights. It's a tale often lost among the grand tombs and dazzling riches of the pharaohs, a story of the unnamed multitudes whose forced labor forged an immortal legacy for their masters, even as their own dreams lay buried in desert graves. As we explore the realities of their existence, the agonies endured in service of pharaonic visions of eternity, I invite you to ponder the unseen human price paid for the wonders we marvel at today. The uncomfortable truth that the soaring achievements which have long captured the world's imagination were built on a foundation of immense human suffering. But before we confront those harsher truths, let us first paint a picture of the vibrant ancient society that flourished along the Nile's nourishing banks. The Egypt of the pharaohs was a land of abundance and order, where the annual inundation of the great river sustained a thriving civilization. Fields of swaying wheat and barley stretched towards the horizon, while papyrus marshes rustled in the breeze. In bustling cities and mud-brick villages, life pulsed to the rhythm of the seasons. As artisans crafted their wares, scribes penned sacred texts, and merchants plied their trade in the marketplaces. At the pinnacle of this world stood the pharaoh, the living god who ruled as the earthly incarnation of the falcon-headed deity Horus. From lavish palaces, the kings of Egypt wielded absolute power over their lands and subjects. They led mighty armies to expand the empire's bounds, presided over complex rituals to maintain cosmic order, and dreamt of eternity as they commissioned their regal tombs. For in the beliefs of the ancient Egyptians, death was but a doorway, and the marvels built in this life would serve and sustain them in the next. It was the pharaoh's burning desire for eternal remembrance, for an everlasting name that would echo through the ages, which kindled their monumental building ambitions. And none spoke to eternity quite like the pyramids. Rising like petrified sunbeams from the sands, these immense tombs were mountains made by men, stairways to the heavens, passageways for the king's soul to ascend and join the imperishable stars. But such lofty visions came with an earthly cost, a price paid in human toil and tears on an almost unimaginable scale. For these wonders of the ancient world, which have endured for 4,500 years and counting, were raised not by some miraculous means, but by the back-breaking labour of a vast workforce, by tens of thousands of men, women and children, many enslaved, who hefted stone upon stone under the pitiless desert sun, all to immortalise the very pharaohs who held them in bondage. The first great pyramids rose during the Old Kingdom era, around 2600 BCE, and over the following centuries pyramid building would reach its zenith. But long before the first block was cut, A mighty feat of organization and planning took place. Armies of workers were assembled through conquest and subjugation. Prisoners of war from Nubia, Libya, Canaan, and beyond. Their lives now yoked to the pharaoh's eternal glory. Surveyors and engineers painstakingly plotted the pyramid site, aligned to the cardinal points with uncanny precision. An immense logistical operation sprang to life as the king's men marshaled the resources needed for construction on a massive scale. Down in the quarries, teams of laborers toiled to cut the pyramid's building blocks from the limestone bedrock. With copper chisels, bronze saws, wooden rollers and sleds, and an incalculable expenditure of human strength, they gradually prized free the stones that would shape a mountain. From dawn to dusk they worked, hacking and heaving in clouds of rock dust under the watchful eyes of overseers, knowing the lash awaited any who dared lag. The stone blocks, some weighing over 2 tons, then had to be transported to the construction site. It was a monumental undertaking, fraught with peril at every turn. During the annual Nile flood, barges were loaded up with stone and floated to the pyramid site when the water levels allowed passage. But off-season, the backbreaking work of hauling the blocks over land fell to the slaves. With ropes and wooden rollers, they inched the megaliths across the sand, straining and struggling for every foot of progress. Slips, falls, crushing accidents were an ever-present danger, and many lives were lost beneath the implacable weight of stone. At the construction site, the pyramid slowly took shape and rose towards the heavens, built from the bottom up one level at a time. The geometry had to be perfect. The base level and true, the blocks precisely placed, the angles aligned just so as the pyramid tapered smoothly upwards. Ramps of mud brick, rubble and clay allowed the heavy blocks to be hauled up the ever-steepening sides. Levers, pulleys and sleds aided the slaves in their Sisyphean struggle skyward. But it remained punishing work, the physical and mental strain beyond measure, knowing that one misstep could send a multi-ton block tumbling down in a deadly cascade. Even as the king's everlasting tomb inched nearer to completion, the everyday reality for the workforce remained one of grinding misery. The pyramids took shape not in quiet solitude, but within the clamour of sprawling workers' villages thrown up nearby to house the armies of labourers. Here they dwelled in cramped, sweltering conditions, packed into basic mud brick barracks, sleeping in shifts between the endless labour. Their sustenance was meagre. Rations of coarse bread, weak beer, a few vegetables, supplemented by the occasional fish or fowl if lucky. Just enough to fuel another day's quota of toil. The health toll on the slave labourers was immense. Skeletons from worker cemeteries show the marks of lives cut short by brutal working conditions. Fractured bones, spinal deformities and arthritic joints testify to years of hard labour and industrial accidents. Malnutrition and stunted growth speak to a scanty diet from childhood. Rampant infections, parasites and diseases, tuberculosis, pneumonia, dysentery, smallpox, malaria, schistosomiasis, scythed through the exhausted, immunocompromised workforce in devastating epidemics. All this, combined with occasional beatings from overseers, meant few pyramid labourers lived past 30. Injury, illness or death brought little respite. The pharaoh's megalomaniacal schemes pushed ever onwards. Lagging progress could not be tolerated. In this pressure cooker environment, an ambitious vizier might see an opportunity to advance his station and curry favour by any means necessary. One such vizier was Hemiunu, who oversaw the building of the Great Pyramid of Giza for Pharaoh Khufu. A shrewd and ruthless operator, Hemiunu was determined to finish the king's tomb in record time. To achieve this, he imposed a punishing regimen on the workforce, relentlessly raising quotas, lengthening shifts, and meeting any hint of defiance with brutal crackdowns. Pushed beyond endurance, some of the labourers dared to lay down tools, refusing to haul another block unless rations improved. Hemiunu's response was swift and merciless. dissent could spread like wildfire if not stamped out. The vizier needed to make an example pour encourager les autres. The ringleaders of the brief strike were seized and publicly flogged, before being permanently consigned to the hardest, most dangerous quarry labour. The rest were starved into submission until the pharaoh's grand design could proceed apace once again. Year after backbreaking year, block by heavy block, the king's monument to eternity crawled skywards at great human cost. Perhaps some of the labourers took a certain weary pride in their stonemasonry accomplishments, channeling their suffering into something that would long outlast their shortened lifespans. But many must have struggled to see anything but futility and injustice as they broke their bodies on the whims of a deified despot. Whatever promise of a pharaoh's eternal favour in the afterlife held scant comfort in the daily grind of hunger, heat, exhaustion, and servitude in this one. At last, after an average of 20 years' labour by a workforce of up to 40,000, the pharaoh would have his finished pyramid. Standing over 400 feet tall, sheathed in gleaming white limestone, tipped by a golden pyramidion to catch the sun's first and last light, it was a breathtaking, heartbreaking sight to those who had raised it. The pharaoh, now a wizened old man nearing his own journey to eternity, could gaze up at the stone mountain bearing his name and dream of immortality. The labourers who had realised that dream with their sweat and blood would have no such luxury. Most who had started the project had long since met anonymous ends, buried in simple sand graves near the site, the location of their eternal rest, long lost to the ages. For those slaves who had survived to see the capstone placed, all that remained was to ready the pyramid complex for the pharaoh's lavish funeral. Causeways, chapels, and temples were constructed, furnished with dazzling art and sacred statuary. Boats were built and buried to carry the king's soul across the night sky. The sarcophagus chamber high in the pyramid's heart was fitted with mighty granite plugs, an engineer's best effort to thwart grave robbers. And when at last the pharaoh was laid to eternal rest amid untold grave goods of gold and alabaster, the narrow ascending passage was sealed forever, the vast tomb now deathly silent. The great work was done. In the nearly 5,000 years since, the sands of time have scoured the pyramids of their smooth limestone faces, leaving stepped tiers of weathered blocks standing stark against the desert. The pharaohs themselves endure now only as desiccated mummies and names in crumbling hieroglyphs, their visions of an opulent afterlife, long since plundered by persistent robbers. The kingdoms they built have long faded to dust, the gods they revered now consigned to myth. In the end, only their mountains of stone remain, timeless, inscrutable, seemingly as eternal as the kings had dreamt. And what of the untold tens of thousands of slaves who raised them at such terrible human cost? The multitudes who lived, laboured and died under the lash to realise one man's megalomaniacal vision of forever. Their names are lost to us, their individual existences unrecorded in the annals of history. No grand tombs or inscriptions preserve their stories. Their suffering was not the stuff of royal chronicles or noble art. In death as in life they remain invisible, interred in the humblest of desert graves near the monuments that consumed them. A poignant, overlooked postscript to the official narrative. But perhaps, as we gaze up at these wonders of the ancient world, we might spare a thought for the unknown men and women who built them block by backbreaking block. The ones who brought the pharaoh's impossible visions to stony life, even as their own dreams crumbled to desert dust beneath the unforgiving sun. In the play of light and shadow on weathered limestone, we might imagine their long stilled hands, their straining backs, their weary, upturned faces, a silent testament to the human cost of the eternal. Our tale draws to a close, dear listener, but the story of the pyramids endures, etched in stone and the human heart. May we marvel at these wonders, even as we mourn the suffering behind the splendor, the lives lost to the cause of forever. And in our own fleeting time on this earth, may we build our monuments with compassion, our legacies on a bedrock of humanity. The pharaohs dreamt of eternity. Perhaps the greatest eternal legacy is a world where the cost of wonders is not counted in human misery. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey to the distant past, for lending an ear to the lost voices in the sands. Perhaps our paths will cross again on another soothing delve into the fascinating, forgotten corners of history. But for now, I bid you a fond farewell and the most restorative of rests. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may visions of golden sands and eternal stone carry you gently to sleep's embrace. Until next time. As the vizier ruthlessly pursued his ambitions, slaves toiled under the scorching desert sun to keep pace with his grueling deadlines. Limestone blocks had to be cut, transported, and hoisted into place with relentless speed and precision. Stumbling or slacking off could mean brutal lashings from the overseer's whips. Accidents were commonplace as exhausted workers lost focus or footing. Imagine being one of these pyramid builders, perhaps a young man named Ahmose, wrenched from his homeland to serve the pharaoh's grandiose vision. Ahmose's days started before dawn, roused from a fitful slumber to gulp down meager rations of coarse bread and beer. He would then join the daily march to the construction site, an ant among thousands in this monumental endeavor. At the quarry, Ahmose would toil for hours under the watchful eyes of overseers, chiseling huge blocks of limestone out of the bedrock. The stones were then loaded onto wooden sleds and hauled by gangs of slaves to the pyramid site. Ahmose and his fellow laborers heaved on ropes, their bare feet sinking into the hot sand, straining to drag the multi-ton blocks up specially constructed ramps. As the pyramid rose higher and higher, so too did the human cost. Falls from the dizzying heights meant almost certain death. Heavy blocks could slip and crush limbs or bodies. The constant inhalation of stone dust led to agonizing lung ailments, and the unrelenting exertion in the brutal heat caused many slaves to collapse from heat exhaustion, never to rise again. Through it all, the vizier remained fixated on his goals, his heart hardened to the suffering of those beneath him. He had risen from minor nobility to become the pharaoh's right-hand man, and he was determined not to fail his divine master. The very stones of the pyramid were to be cemented with the blood and sweat of slaves like Ahmose. For Ahmose and his fellow bondsmen, there was little reprieve from the interminable labor. At day's end, they would stumble back to the cramped, filthy workers' village, gulping down a watery beer or gruel before collapsing into sleep. The grueling cycle would resume the next morning. Many would not live to see the final capstone placed atop the pharaoh's great monument. Life was bleak for these pyramid builders, their existence reduced to an endless cycle of back-breaking work, meager sustenance, and brief, dreamless sleep. They were faceless cogs in a mighty machine, toiling to build a legacy that would endure for millennia, with scant hope of any reward in this life or the next. As the smooth white limestone casing stones were finally fitted onto the pyramid's exterior, the vizier could look upon his handiwork with immense pride. The pharaoh would be well pleased, and the vizier's place in the annals of history was surely secure. But for Ahmose and the thousands of other slaves who had labored and died to build this wonder, there would be no such glory. In the end, Ahmose's broken body was laid unceremoniously into a simple grave pit, along with countless others who had succumbed to the pitiless conditions. These brutal lives, consigned to oblivion, were the dark foundation upon which the pharaohs built their eternal resting places. As the last blocks were set in place and the pharaoh's lavish burial goods were transferred into the pyramid's inner sanctum, one could only marvel at the immense scale of it all. The ancient Egyptians had marshaled an almost unimaginable amount of human labor and suffering to construct these enduring icons of their civilization's power and grandeur. But as with so many of humanity's great endeavors, the uncomfortable reality behind the achievement was often swept aside. The names and stories of men like Ahmose were lost to the ages, buried in the desert sands like the pharaoh's treasures. In the end, only the stark monumentality of the pyramids themselves would endure as a testament to their pain and sacrifice. Gazing up at the looming edifices today, one cannot help but shudder at the thought of the intense human agony that went into their creation. The pyramids are not just mathematical marvels or feats of engineering, but somber memorials to the untold legions of slaves who gave their blood, toil, and very lives to build them. This is the hidden story behind the majestic pyramids that still cast their long shadows across the Egyptian desert. A story of ambition, subjugation, heartache, and backbreaking labor. Though their names are lost to history, the legacy of Ahmose and his fellow bondsmen is forever etched into every limestone block, a testament to the indomitable human spirit in the face of tyranny and adversity. So, as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for these long-forgotten souls, the humble men and women whose short, brutal lives were spent in service to the pharaoh's vainglorious dreams. May they find in death the peace and rest that eluded them in life, beside the eternal monuments they raised with their own calloused hands. And may we remember them not just as slaves, but as human beings of flesh, blood, hopes, and sorrows. This is their story, the story of the faceless multitudes upon whose suffering the wonders of the ancient world were built. A story that whispers to us from every weathered stone, urging us to ponder the weight of their sacrifice. The pyramids endure as timeless emblems of human ingenuity and determination. Yes, but also as poignant reminders of the steep price that is often paid for greatness. The scorching desert heat beats down upon the barren landscape as another day of backbreaking labor commences. From a distance, the half-built pyramid already towers imposingly over the horizon, its gleaming white limestone blocks stacked precisely, one by one, as if reaching longingly for the heavens above. Yet for the thousands of exhausted slaves toiling endlessly at its base, this awe-inspiring sight evokes only dread and despair. With aching muscles, parched throats, and hearts heavy with the knowledge that many will not live to see the monument's completion, they pour every ounce of their strength into hauling the gargantuan stones up the ever-steepening incline. Their worn and blistered hands grip frayed ropes as they strain against the unyielding weight, feet slipping in the shifting sand. The air resounds with the groans of men pushed beyond the brink of exhaustion, the crack of whips wielded by merciless overseers, and the ceaseless pounding of chisels shaping each block to perfection. Among the downtrodden labourers, a few faces stand out, weather-beaten, scarred, yet holding on to a faint glimmer of grim determination. These are the veterans who have endured season after grueling season, watching their comrades succumb one by one to injury, disease, or sheer despair. They toil on in silent, stubborn defiance, knowing all too well that their own fates likely hold no kinder future. As the sun crawls across the sky, its unrelenting glare amplified by the reflecting limestone, the pyramid inch by painstaking inch continues its slow ascent heavenward. To the noble architects and priests overseeing the sacred work, each block represents one step closer to the pharaoh's immortal glory. But to the broken men who haul them, the stones are bitter reminders of their stolen lives, their forgotten dreams, their inescapable misery. When dusk finally descends, and the workers drag themselves back to their cramped, squalid hovels, a few mouthfuls of coarse bread and beer await to sustain them for another day of the same unending torment. In the fleeting moments before exhaustion claims them, some gather around flickering fires to share hushed tales of their distant homelands, forever lost to them now. Others simply collapse into a dreamless slumber, praying to gods both old and new that they may not wake to see the morrow. As the night deepens and stars wheel silently overhead, it's almost possible to forget the immense human suffering that underlies this audacious endeavor. The pharaoh sleeps in his sumptuous palace, secure in his divinely ordained privilege, while his viziers and engineers make their meticulous plans for the next day's labor. The cycle continues, as it has for years uncounted and will for years to come. The pyramid inch by hard-won inch clawing its way toward completion. Only the whisper of the wind through the gaunt and lifeless desert serves as witness to the untold stories of pain, loss, and desperate resilience etched into every limestone block. In the great tapestry of history, the individual threads of each slave's life may be lost, but their legacy endures in the soaring monuments that have outlasted empires. For all the magnificence of the pharaoh's tombs, perhaps the true wonder is the tenacity of the human spirit that persevered in the face of such cruelty to build them. Though the day's labor has ended, the pyramid builders' trials are far from over. In their fitful slumber, fevered dreams mingle with anguished memories of loved ones left behind, and the gnawing ache of wounds both physical and emotional. Some murmur prayers to ancestors they will likely never again lay eyes upon. Others weep quietly for the bleakness of their stolen futures. Yet even amidst such unrelenting darkness, there endure small sparks of solidarity, compassion, even hope among these downtrodden souls. A seasoned laborer shares his meager rations with a sickly youth, remembering the kindness once shown to him by a now departed friend. A homesick Nubian hums a half-forgotten lullaby, bringing a moment's peace to those huddled around him. A grizzled grandfather regales wide-eyed children with fanciful tales of lands beyond the desert, gods both stern and forgiving, and a life after death where even the lowliest slave may find reward for their earthly sufferings. These tender mercies, ephemeral though they may be, somehow sustain the slave workers through each day of crushing labor beneath the overseer's punishing whips. They cling to these fleeting reminders of their shared humanity, even as the monuments they toil ceaselessly to create stand as testaments to the rulers who have so callously robbed them of it. And so the days bleed one into the next under the merciless sun, the once distant pyramid looming ever larger against the horizon until it seems to swallow the sky itself. The aging laborers, who have endured season after brutal season, wonder numbly if it will be illness, injury, or simply despair that claims them before they can witness the monumental task's completion. The younger ones, still harboring fragile dreams of freedom, furtively share whispered plans of daring escapes and defiant uprisings, not yet broken by the weight of their cruel reality. Still the work grinds relentlessly on. The fortunate perish quickly, their suffering at an end. The unfortunate survive to drag their weathered bodies up the accursed ramp yet again, hauling stone after back-breaking stone to the drumbeat of their own weary hearts. All the while, the pharaoh's impossible vision crawls inexorably skyward, fueled by the blood and sweat and shattered spirits of the wretches at its base. Generations are born into bondage and ground to dust, knowing nothing beyond a world of endless toil in service of another man's glory. Never truly living, yet unable to escape the yoke until death itself takes pity. The viziers and priests make their pious offerings to gods of stone and beseech the blessings of an eternal paradise, never comprehending the hell their ambitions have wrought on earth. As the oppressive weeks turn to interminable months and years, it becomes an open question which will be completed first: the pharaoh's monument to his own vanity, or the extinction of the very souls of those condemned to build it. With each sunset, a few more laborers stumble broken from the scaffolds, finally released to whatever scrap of peace awaits them in the hereafter. Their brethren mourn in muted sorrow. even as they envy the deliverance that eludes their own calloused grasp for yet another wretched day. And still the limestone blocks pile ever higher against the shimmering horizon, as if straining to pierce the vault of heaven itself in a vain quest for permanence. Perhaps the true measure of the pyramid's legacy lies not in its audacious height or in the kingly hubris that demanded its creation, but in the quiet tenacity of the faceless thousands who purchased its immortality with their own. For in the end, what are the mighty pharaohs but the sum of the forgotten slaves whose forced labours and stolen lives made their vainglory possible? Let the stony sentinel stand as much a testament to the cruel whims of tyranny as to the invincible endurance of the oppressed masses, whose toil raised them up from the shifting desert sands. In the fading light of dusk, the long shadows of the pyramid builders stretch mournfully across the barren landscape as they shuffle with leaden steps back to their pitiful hovels. Heads bowed, shoulders stooped under the weight of their bleak existence. They seem but wraiths, pale shades of the vibrant human beings they might once have been or dreamed of becoming, had the accident of their birth not shackled them to another's grandiose ambition. But even as their warm bodies crumple onto thin pallets, exhaustion swiftly pulling them into merciful oblivion, the overseers are already sharpening their whips and readying their cruel scourges for the morrow's labour. For the mighty pyramid will not build itself, and human suffering is a small price to pay for the immortal glory of the pharaoh and the empire that cowers beneath his godlike whims. The flickering campfires sputter and die, plunging the wretched workers' encampment into Stygian darkness, as profound as the hopelessness that pervades every waking moment. In the distance, the cyclopean silhouette of the half-built tomb looms like an ominous spectre, its unfinished edges clawing at the star-flecked sky, as if yearning to swallow the heavens themselves. Huddled against the chill of the desert night, the pyramid builders find little respite in sleep's fleeting embrace. Their dreams are haunted by the ceaseless rasp of copper chisels on limestone, the soulless bark of taskmasters' orders, the anguished groans of their fellow slaves stumbling under back-breaking burdens. Even in slumber, there can be no true escape from the miserable fate to which they have been doomed by an accident of birth and the unchecked avarice of their king. But perhaps the most insidious torment is the faint, stubborn flicker of hope that still festers in the most secret chambers of their hearts. That fragile dream of one day casting off their chains, of returning to the distant lands and loved ones from which they were so cruelly ripped, of knowing even a single day of freedom and joy and self-determination before death's sweet oblivion. It is this elusive wisp of a possibility, however remote, that makes the soul-crushing despair of their daily existence all the more unbearable. And yet, as the first pale fingers of dawn stretch hesitantly across the eastern horizon, heralding the onset of another day of crushing drudgery, the pyramid builders stir from their squalid pallets and shoulder their invisible burdens once more. With cracked lips and hollow eyes, they shuffle resignedly towards the monumental hubris taking shape at the desert's edge, knowing all too well the merciless lash and deprivation that awaits them should they falter. And so the cycle of suffering continues, as it has for generations beyond counting, the forgotten slaves toiling to build monuments to the pharaoh's vanity beneath the sun's punishing glare. The limestone blocks stack ever higher, the ramps gouge ever deeper into the desert's dusty skin, and the unseen mountain of human misery swells with each passing day beneath the overseer's pitiless whips. In the great tapestry of human history, the names and faces of the pyramid builders may be lost to the unforgiving sands of time, but their legacy endures in every soaring block and in the enduring mystery that shrouds these ancient wonders. For what are the pyramids if not a testament to the untold sacrifices of the nameless thousands who gave their blood, their sweat, and their very lives to realize one man's impossible dream of immortality? As the sun reaches its merciless zenith and the day's labours reach a fevered pitch, it is all too easy to lose sight of the individual tragedies unfolding in the shadow of the pharaoh's ambition. The young mother, torn from her infant's desperate grasp to haul stones until her body gives out. The once proud hunter, reduced to a skeletal wraith by years of grinding privation. The hopeful dreamer, his aspirations shattered like the bones beneath his overseer's cudgel. But perhaps most tragic of all are the children born into this bleak cycle of bondage, knowing no other life than one of ceaseless toil and soul-crushing despair. Their innocent smiles swiftly fade, their once bright eyes dulling as the cruel reality of their existence sinks in. Some scarcely taste the first fruits of youth before they are old enough to join their elders beneath the overseer's lash, their fragile hopes crushed before they ever truly take wing. And yet, even amidst such unrelenting darkness, there are fleeting moments of near imperceptible light. The furtive comfort shared between two exhausted labourers, the whispered snatch of a half-remembered song from a land left behind, the delicate blossom stubbornly pushing through a crack in the sun-baked earth. These tiny sparks of humanity, ephemeral and all too easily snuffed out, somehow make the unremitting bleakness all the more poignant in their scarcity. As the long day inches towards its weary close and lengthening shadows stretch their fingers across the pharaoh's monument to his own hubris, the pyramid builders toil on like ants scrabbling across the flanks of a giant. Knees buckle, lungs heave, and still the implacable taskmasters urge them on, deaf to the chorus of human suffering rising beneath the clamour of construction. With the setting sun's blood-red rays painting the half-built tomb an eerie scarlet, the bone-weary slaves drag themselves back to their pitiful hovels, knowing only too well that the morrow will bring more of the same unrelenting misery. Some tend to injured comrades with a kind of listless despair, aware that a broken body is all too often a death sentence in this pitiless world. Others simply collapse into a dreamless slumber, their aching muscles and abraded skin scarcely distinguishable from the calluses that armour their shattered souls. And yet, even in the deepest pits of exhaustion and hopelessness, that insidious spark of stubborn, senseless hope persists. That impossible dream of freedom, of reunion with lost loved ones, of a life lived on one's own terms before death's final liberation. It is a feeble, flickering thing, guttering like a candle in the hurricane roar of their suffering. Yet somehow, it endures against all odds, a mute testament to the indomitable resilience of the human spirit. As the last light fades from the sky and the great pyramid is swallowed by the night's inky blackness, the eternal dance of hope and despair plays out in the secret theatre of each labourer's dreams. Some ride that fragile wisp of promise to lands far beyond their waking agonies, while others find their fantastical escape snuffed out by the crushing weight of their reality. But all will rise with the dawn to toil and struggle and suffer anew, their lives inexorably bound to the stone colossus that devours their days. Thus the years roll on, an implacable wheel of torment grinding down generation after generation, as the pharaoh's folly claws its way towards the heavens block by backbreaking block. The kings and viziers congratulate themselves on their godlike might, never realizing that their true immortality lies not in their stony monuments but in the untold stories of pain and loss and unvanquished dignity buried beneath the desert sands. It is these forgotten lives, these faceless thousands, who bought the pharaoh's vain dream of eternity with their blood and tears, that are the true wonder of the ancient world. For in the end, long after the names of the mighty have crumbled to dust and their tombs have weathered into obscurity, the enduring spirit of the pyramid builders will live on, a testament to the soaring potential and the staggering tragedy of the human condition, carved in immutable stone. As we delve deeper into the lives of the pyramid builders, it's important to consider the figure who oversaw this monumental undertaking, The vizier. The vizier served as the pharaoh's right-hand man, managing the affairs of the state and ensuring that the pharaoh's grand ambitions came to fruition. One can imagine a particularly clever and ruthless vizier rising through the ranks, proving his worth by delivering results in the construction of the pharaoh's eternal monument. This vizier was a man driven by ambition, always seeking ways to advance his own station and gain favor with the pharaoh. He knew that his success and status depended on the speedy progress of the pyramid construction. The faster the pyramid rose towards the heavens, the higher the vizier's own star would ascend in the court. To achieve this, the vizier would have imposed grueling conditions and quotas on the slaves laboring on the pyramid. He likely pushed them to their limits, demanding they work longer hours under the scorching desert sun with fewer breaks for rest and meager rations of food and water. The vizier's overseers would have cracked the whip, both figuratively and literally, to squeeze every ounce of labor from the slaves. One can envision the vizier striding through the construction site, his keen eyes inspecting every detail, ensuring that not a moment was wasted in idle rest. He would have calculated the number of blocks that needed to be quarried, transported, and placed each day to keep up with his ambitious construction schedule. Any perceived slowdowns or inefficiencies would have been met with swift and severe punishment. The vizier's unyielding drive likely pushed the slaves to the brink of exhaustion and despair. The incessant toil, heat, and deprivation would have worn them down physically and mentally. Some may have harbored resentment and anger towards the vizier and the overseers, seeing them as the cruel instruments of their suffering. It's not hard to imagine that at some point, this simmering discontent boiled over into an outright slave rebellion. The slaves, with little left to lose, may have refused to work, attacked their overseers, or attempted a desperate escape. Word would have quickly reached the vizier of this disruption to his carefully laid plans. The vizier, ever ruthless and calculating, would have responded with brutal force to quash the rebellion and restore order. He likely ordered the rebellious slaves to be made an example of, to be publicly beaten or executed as a warning to the others. The vizier knew that he could not afford any delays or disruptions if he was to meet the pharaoh's deadline and maintain his favored position. Through sheer force of will and merciless tactics, the vizier would have crushed the rebellion and gotten the slaves back to their ceaseless labor. The construction of the pyramid continued, the grand monument rising ever higher, even as the hopes and spirits of the slaves sank ever lower. One can paint a vivid picture of this driven and despotic vizier, whip in hand, standing atop the rising pyramid, surveying his domain with a sense of satisfaction and self-importance. For him, the lives of the slaves were a small price to pay for the advancement of his own station and the realization of the pharaoh's glorious vision. The figure of the ambitious vizier adds a layer of individual human ruthlessness and calculated cruelty to the story of the pyramid's construction. His drive for power and glory, mirroring that of the pharaoh himself, likely compounded the suffering of the slaves and served as a personified instrument of their oppression. The vizier's story provides a chilling insight into the minds and motivations of those who wielded power in ancient Egypt, and the human cost that was paid to satisfy their ambitions. As the vizier's whip cracked under the desert sun, the sounds of chisels on stone and the straining of ropes and pulleys continued unabated. The pyramid rose ever higher, a testament to the pharaoh's might, the vizier's ruthless efficiency, and the incalculable suffering of the nameless slaves who toiled and died to build a monument for the ages. With the relentless quotas and the threat of brutal punishment hanging over them, the slaves had little choice but to continue their back-breaking labor. From dawn until dusk, they hefted limestone blocks, hauled them up the ever-growing pyramid, and maneuvered them precisely into place under the watchful eyes of the overseers. As the pyramid neared completion, the work shifted to adding the finishing touches that would transform the stepped structure into a smooth-sided, gleaming monument. Specially skilled workers would have been brought in to cut and fit the casing stones, the smooth white limestone blocks that would cover the entire pyramid, giving it its iconic, polished appearance. These casing stones were cut and transported with the same meticulous care as the core blocks of the pyramid. Each one was precisely dressed and fitted tightly against its neighbours, with the joins so fine that one could barely slide a thin blade between them. The casing stones were polished to a high sheen, reflecting the brilliant sunlight and giving the pyramid an otherworldly glow. At the very apex of the pyramid, the final touch was the placement of the pyramidion, the small pointed capstone that completed the structure. This special block, often carved from a single piece of fine limestone or even granite, would have been adorned with inscriptions and symbols befitting its significance. Placing the pyramidion was a momentous event, signifying the completion of the pharaoh's eternal monument. One can imagine the sense of anticipation and trepidation as the pyramidion was hauled up the great ramps to the top of the pyramid. A team of skilled workers, perhaps even the vizier himself, would have carefully guided the capstone into place, ensuring its perfect alignment. With the final placement of the pyramidion, the pyramid was complete, a gleaming, geometrically perfect monument that seemed to reach to the very heavens themselves. For the slaves who had laboured so long and so hard on the pyramid, the completion of the structure brought little relief or satisfaction. Their work was far from over, as there were still temples, courtyards, and causeways to be built around the pyramid complex. These ancillary structures were vital components of the pharaoh's funerary cult, providing a place for offerings, rituals, and worship that would sustain the pharaoh's spirit in the afterlife. The construction of these surrounding monuments required the same back-breaking labour and meticulous craftsmanship as the pyramid itself. Slaves would have toiled to cut and transport limestone blocks, carve intricate reliefs and hieroglyphs, and erect soaring columns and obelisks in honour of the pharaoh and the gods. Even as the last stones were being placed and the paint was still drying on the colourful reliefs, preparations were underway for the pharaoh's funeral. The pyramid complex was not just a monument, but a machine for the pharaoh's resurrection and eternal life. Every element had to be in place and perfectly functional to ensure the pharaoh's successful journey into the afterlife. One can only imagine the mix of exhaustion, dread, and perhaps even a grim satisfaction that the slaves might have felt as they witnessed the final preparations for the pharaoh's burial. Their monumental labour was nearing its end, but at what cost? The completed pyramid stood as an eternal testament to the pharaoh's power and glory. But for the slaves, it was a reminder of their own expendability and the brutal conditions they endured in service of this vision. As the funeral procession wound its way towards the pyramid, carrying the pharaoh's mummified body and the rich grave goods that would accompany him into eternity, the slaves who had built this monument may have watched with a complex mix of emotions: pride in their accomplishment, relief at the end of their toil, resentment at their suffering, and perhaps even a flicker of hope that their role in building the pharaoh's tomb might grant them some small favour in the afterlife. But for most of the slaves, the completion of the pyramid brought only the grim certainty of more toil, more suffering, and an early grave. As the pharaoh was laid to rest in his eternal home, the slaves returned to their labour, building the next monument, serving the next pharaoh, with little hope of relief or reward in this life or the next. The gleaming white pyramid, shimmering in the desert sun, stood as an eternal symbol of the power and ambition of the pharaohs, and the incalculable cost in human lives and suffering that made these monuments possible. For the slaves who built them, the pyramids were not just tombs for their god-kings, but the tombs of their own hopes, dreams, and lives, given in service to a vision of eternity that they would never share. The vizier stood tall and proud as he surveyed the progress on the pharaoh's newest pyramid. Hundreds of slaves labored beneath the scorching sun, hauling massive blocks of limestone up the emerging stepped sides of the monument. Their bronzed skin glistened with sweat, muscles straining against the weight. The rhythmic heave of ropes and grunting of men filled the air. The vizier allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. He had risen far in his ambitious career, from lowly scribe to the pharaoh's right-hand man, entrusted with overseeing this most critical of royal constructions. The pyramid would ensure the pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife and provide a grand stage on which to recount his life's accomplishments for all eternity. And the vizier intended to deliver it in record time to gain even greater favor. He strode along the edge of the construction site, his fine linen robe stirring the dust at his feet. Suddenly, a pained cry pierced the air. The vizier whirled around to see a slave crumpled on the ground, gripping his crushed and bloody foot. A heavy block had slipped from the hands of an exhausted worker and landed on the unfortunate man. The injured slave rocked back and forth, wailing. "Back to work, all of you!" the vizier shouted. "You there, get this trash out of the way." He snapped his fingers at two burly guards. They grabbed the slave under his arms and dragged him off, leaving a smear of blood in the sand. The slave's moans faded as he was unceremoniously dumped in a shadowy corner of the work camp to either recover or die. It mattered little which. He was easily replaced. Such accidents were all too common on a project of this scale and pace. Slaves fell from the scaffolding, were struck by falling blocks, or simply collapsed and never got up again. Their bodies broken by toil, hunger, and abuse. They were buried hastily in shallow graves, while work on the pyramid continued without pause. Flesh and blood were cheap. Limestone was precious. The vizier wiped the sheen of sweat from his brow and took a sip of cool water offered by a servant. His eyes drifted across the teeming worksite to the clusters of mud brick huts beyond. The squalid workers' village, where the pyramid builders laid their weary bodies each night. The place had sprung up almost overnight when construction began, as thousands of slaves were brought in from across the empire to labor on the pharaoh's most ambitious monument yet. In the evening, smoke from cooking fires rose above the village as the men huddled in their meager family groups to eat their small rations of coarse bread, onions, and salt fish. The fortunate ones still had wives and children to provide some comfort and help prepare meals after the long, back-breaking day. Others had lost their loved ones to disease, deprivation, or the overseer's lash. As darkness fell, an eerie silence descended, broken only by the distant cries of birds along the Nile. The bone-weary men drifted off to sleep on threadbare mats, snatching a few hours of escape before the next day of toil began. Their waking hours knew only hardship as they labored to build a magnificent tomb for the pharaoh's eternal ease. Such was the stark divide between ruler and slave. The vizier had no pity for the wretched workers. His only concern was that they continue to haul stone and keep the pharaoh's grand vision rising towards the heavens. If they faltered, he had no compunction against applying the whip, withholding rations, or making gruesome examples of the weakest to spur the rest to greater efforts. One day, the vizier arrived at the site to find work halted and the slaves gathered in an angry knot, shouting and shaking their fists. Fearful whispers reached his ears. The men were refusing to work, demanding more food and rest. The vizier's lips curled in a sneer. He would soon quash this unprecedented act of defiance. He called the guards and overseers to him. "Beat them," he hissed. "Beat them until they beg to get back to work, and put the ringleaders to death before the others, slowly, as a lesson." The guards waded into the ragged crowd, swinging clubs and cracking whips. The slaves scattered in panic, most fleeing back to their positions on the pyramid. The ringleaders were dragged forward, struggling and shouting slogans of resistance. One by one, they were brutally executed in front of the cowed workers, impaled, flayed, disemboweled. Their broken bodies were left in the sun as a warning. The vizier nodded in grim approval as the chastened slaves returned to their labours, eyes downcast. Rebellion averted, construction could continue. The pharaoh would have his eternal monument, no matter how many perished to build it. The mathematics of glory were measured in limestone, not lives. As the months wore on, the pyramid rose higher and higher, a staircase to the heavens. The vizier watched in satisfaction as the final blocks were hauled into place and skilled artisans began smoothing the stepped sides into sleek, gleaming triangles. Soon, the shining white limestone casing stones would be added, followed by the glittering pyramidion capstone. The pharaoh's magnificent tomb would be complete. But the vizier had little time to savour his crowning accomplishment. Already, the pharaoh was making grand plans for an even larger pyramid for his chief queen, to be built right next to his own. The vizier would be entrusted with its speedy construction, and he relished the challenge that would set him above all others in the royal court. He walked among the wretched workers' huts, eyes gleaming as he estimated how many more slaves would be needed for the new, even more ambitious project. They could be worked even harder, fed even less. More would die, but that was of no consequence. The promise of eternal glory was too tempting to deny. Let the pyramids rise, and let the blood of slaves be the mortar that binds their stones. In the millennia to come, the vizier's name would be forgotten, as would the names of the numberless slaves, whose toil and suffering built the enduring wonders of the pharaohs. But perhaps, on a still desert night, a quiet whisper of remembrance would stir the sands around the time-worn monuments. A whisper of tragedy, of unimaginable human cost. A whisper that even the mightiest works of kings cannot drown out the heavy silence of untold thousands gone to their graves in agony and anonymity. Beneath the sweat-drenched brows and bronzed backs of the pyramid builders toiled an ambitious young vizier named Hemiunu. Born into a noble family, Hemiunu displayed a sharp intellect and ruthless drive from an early age that caught the eye of the aging pharaoh Khufu. As the pharaoh's health declined, he entrusted Hemiunu with overseeing the construction of his eternal resting place, the great pyramid that would surpass all others in size and majesty. Hemiunu knew that completing such a monumental undertaking on schedule would require extracting every ounce of labour from the workforce. He set about establishing strict quotas, organised the men into competing teams, and imposed harsh punishments for any sign of slacking. The already grueling conditions in the Giza quarries and construction site grew even more unbearable under Hemiunu's watch. The vizier would make surprise inspections, his eyes narrow and calculating as they roved over the ranks of haggard labourers. Woe betide the man who dared to straighten his back for a moment's respite when Hemiunu was near. A signal from the vizier could spell a brutal lashing or worse. Some bone-tired slaves who stumbled and slowed the block-hauling teams even had their hands chopped off as an example to the others. As the sun's rays seared the sand and the limestone blocks glared with blinding whiteness, Hemiunu watched the Great Pyramid inch its way towards the heavens block by painstaking block. This would be his legacy, he thought to himself, the achievement that would make his name immortal. If it took driving thousands of expendable slaves to an early grave, then so be it. Visions of power and prestige danced in Hemiunu's mind, spurring him to ever greater cruelty in his quest to make quota. But the vizier underestimated the limits of human endurance. As the death toll mounted and the surviving slaves grew more desperate, a current of unrest crackled through the workforce. Furtive whispers gave way to open defiance as the pyramid builders reached their breaking point. One morning, as Hemiunu arrived to oversee the day's labour, he found the site in upheaval. Angry slaves had downed their tools and stonework, surging towards the vizier and his startled entourage with makeshift cudgels in hand. The royal guards rushed to block their path, but the tide of furious labourers crashed over them, flinging them aside like ragdolls. Hemiunu's eyes widened in shock as the slaves closed in around him, the years of pent-up pain and rage etched on their faces. In the end, not even a man as cunning as Hemiunu could avert his fate at the hands of the oppressed masses he had exploited for so long. The vizier's vision faded to black as he was overcome by the onslaught, never to see his great pyramid completed. The pharaoh was quick to restore order with legions of fresh troops, but from that day on, a kernel of fear lodged in the noble hearts of the king and his court. They had glimpsed, if only for a moment, the latent power of the downtrodden multitudes that oiled the gears of their glorious civilization. Work on the Great Pyramid resumed under the new vizier Ankaf, Hemiunu's half-brother. The labour conditions were eased ever so slightly, and rations increased to keep the grumbling slaves in line. Slowly but surely, the limestone behemoth rose to its full height of 481 feet, the tallest structure made by human hands in the world at the time. Gleaming white in the desert sun, the Great Pyramid inspired awe and disquiet in all who beheld it. For all its perfect proportions and geometric grace, one could not gaze at the Great Pyramid without confronting the immense toll in blood and suffering behind its construction. Indeed, this mighty tomb of Khufu would also serve as the final resting place for many of the slaves who laboured on it. Scattered at the foot of the pyramid lay the simple sand graves of the workers who perished on the job, their modest dreams of earning their freedom and returning to their families dashed. According to ancient Egyptian beliefs, one's eternal fate in the afterlife was determined by the virtue of one's life and the favour of the gods. Surely some of the pyramid builders must have hoped that their backbreaking service would earn them a blessed existence after death, a chance to reap the rewards denied to them in the mortal realm. But for many, the afterlife likely offered simply a release from their earthly torment, an escape from the merciless desert sun, the sting of the overseer's lash, and the crushing weight of the limestone blocks on their shoulders. In the end, the Great Pyramid stands as a complicated testament to the heights of human ambition and the depths of human exploitation. The names of the slaves who built it are lost to history, their agonies unrecorded in the official chronicling of Khufu's glorious reign. But even the mighty pharaoh could not erase their memory entirely. It is there in the smoothness of the pyramid's limestone facing, in the precise alignment of its sides, in the soaring reach of its apex towards the heavens. The Great Pyramid endures as much as a monument to their toil, as it does to Khufu's vanity. As the first shafts of morning light touched the peak of the pyramid, the new teams of slaves assembled for yet another punishing day of construction. But as they gazed up at the looming stone slopes that seemed to defy gravity itself, they could not help but feel a flicker of pride mingled with their dread. They had built this wonder, these forlorn wretches from far-flung lands, with little more than sleds, ramps, levers, and sheer force of sinew and will. In this monumental tomb of Khufu, into which he would take all the opulent trappings of his kingly life, there was also entombed something of the humble slaves who made it possible, block by crushing block, day by searing day. The Great Pyramid may have been the pharaoh's gambit at immortality, but it would outlive the memory of Khufu himself. For all the gold and finery he was buried with, Khufu would remain a half-forgotten husk mouldering in the dark heart of his grand sepulchre. The true legacy of the pyramid belonged to the faceless, numberless workers who inscribed their suffering into its very fabric, whose calloused hands hewed and hauled the stones that would endure for millennia. Long after Khufu's funerary cult had vanished into the sands of time, the Great Pyramid would stand as a hushed, brooding enigma, a riddle in stone that guarded the mysteries of the lives lost in its creation. As the sun traces its daily arc over the Giza plateau, its shifting shadows play across the flanks of the pyramids, imbuing their ageless surfaces with an almost lifelike vitality. One can imagine, if one squints against the haze of heat, the teeming industry of the long-ago construction site, the ant-like figures of the workers swarming over the half-built monuments. Their voices are stilled now, but the pyramids still seem to whisper of their memory, of the incalculable human price paid to realize the vaulting ambitions of the pharaohs. For us in the modern day, the pyramids pose a troubling dilemma. Do we marvel at their audacity and grandeur, or recoil at the thought of the forced labor that made them possible? Do we applaud them as timeless works of art and feats of engineering, or condemn them as symbols of oppression and cruelty? The Great Pyramid and its siblings offer no easy answers, only an invitation to contemplate the dark ironies of history and the capacity of humans to achieve the sublime and the horrific in equal measure. Perhaps in the end, the most fitting tribute to the forgotten slaves of the pyramids is not to resolve this dilemma, but to sit with it in quiet discomfort, to let it bore into our conscience like the pitiless desert sun. For in wrestling with the shadows cast by the pyramids, in trying to grasp the enormity of the suffering that raised them from the sands, we keep alive some faint spark of the humanity of those who toiled and bled and died in their creation. The pharaohs dreamed of immortality, but it is the nameless slaves who built the pyramids that achieve a kind of eternity in stone, an eternity of bearing witness to the darkness and the light of the human condition from across the ages. As the documentary comes to a close, the camera lingers on the enigmatic silhouette of the Great Pyramid against a deepening twilight sky. The last rays of the setting sun paint its peak a brilliant copper, a fleeting crown of light that seems to defy the gathering darkness. And then the moment passes. The pyramid surrenders to the shadows of night, standing sentinel over the secrets of the past, as it has for over 4,000 years. A monument to the eternal yearning of the human spirit to transcend its earthly limits, and to the tragic lengths we will go to fulfill that yearning, the Great Pyramid endures. A mute, majestic embodiment of all that is inspiring and troubling in our shared history. As the screen fades to black, we are left to ponder its meanings in the hush of the desert night. The sprawling pyramid site would have resembled a bustling city, teeming with activity from sunup to sundown. Thousands of laborers would be scattered across the Giza plateau, toiling under the watchful eyes of their overseers. The constant sound of chiseling, the grunts of straining men, creaking of wooden rollers and sleds, and the shouts of orders filled the arid desert air. In one corner of the site, a team of wiry, dark-skinned slaves from Nubia haul massive limestone blocks up a ramp. Shoulders straining, legs burning, they inch their heavy burden forward, knowing the whip awaits any who falter. Nubian captives were prized by the Egyptians for their strength and endurance. But even the hardiest soon wilted under the relentless exertion, meager rations and squalid living conditions at Giza. Among the Nubian gang is a boy named Tahaka, just 14 years old, but already with the lean, muscular build and calloused hands of a veteran laborer. He arrived in Egypt only months ago, dragged from his village by Egyptian raiders, his family slain or scattered. Now he trudges under the weight of the stones, his mind numb, his will to resist broken. He harbors no hopes or dreams beyond clinging to life for another day. At Tahaka's side is an older slave named Khnum. Khnum has toiled for years on pyramid projects with a quiet dignity and skill that even the Egyptian masons grudgingly respect. As they strain together, Khnum mutters encouragement and advice to young Tahaka, forming a fragile bond of solidarity that is their only refuge in this pitiless world. Atop the rising pyramid, a team of masons meticulously sets the blocks into perfect alignment. The pyramid is already over 30 meters tall, and the work is becoming ever slower and more precarious. Wooden cranes and levers assist in hoisting the blocks into place, but it is backbreaking labor to maneuver the stones at such height. Rock falls and lost footing send men plummeting to their deaths with grim regularity. Presiding over the construction with an iron hand is the Vizier Hemiunu, a cunning nobleman and royal architect. Hemiunu is a shrewd tactician and politician whose ambition knows no bounds. The pharaoh Khufu has entrusted him with the monumental task of building the largest and most perfect pyramid ever attempted. Hemiunu knows that his path to greater power and wealth depends entirely on extracting the maximum toil from Khufu's armies of slave labourers. He stalks the construction site, his jewelled whip ever ready, his eyes coldly assessing progress and weakness. He keeps the work teams labouring from dawn to dusk, and in the evening pores over papyrus plans and scale models, seeking any greater efficiency or advantage to be wrung from men and stone. Rest is for the dead, Hemiunu sneers. The pharaoh's tomb cannot wait. For the slaves, there is no respite from the pyramid's demands. At the end of the day, they drag their aching bodies back to the workers' village, a cramped and filthy settlement of mud brick huts alongside the cultivation. There they are fed a basic meal of bread, onions and salt before collapsing into sleep on bare earthen floors. Dysentery, respiratory illness, and infected wounds are constant spectres in these squalid quarters. The weakest quickly succumb, to be buried in shallow desert graves and replaced by fresh slaves. But not all accept their lot mutely. At night, in whispered conferences, some dare to speak of resistance and rebellion. The pharaoh is but a man, not a god, they murmur. Why should we toil to build his tomb while our families starve? Taharka listens wide-eyed to this dangerous talk, a spark of defiance kindling in his heart. But Khnum shakes his head sadly, gesturing at the vizier's soldiers who patrol the camp's perimeter. The pharaoh's reach is long, and his punishment is cruel, he warns. We can only endure and pray the gods grant a kinder fate in the next life. As the months grind on, the pyramid rises higher and higher over the plain, a mountain of stone to immortalize mighty Khufu. But it is built on the backs of tens of thousands of men like Taharka and Khnum, faceless slaves whose lives were shorter than even the first foundation stones. When Khufu is at last borne into the burial chamber deep within the pyramid, and the last capstone is set in place to seal his tomb for eternity, they will already be forgotten. Such was the fate of the pyramid builders of ancient Egypt. For all the soaring beauty and geometric perfection of the pyramids they left behind, there is a brutal human cost embedded in every stone. The blood and sweat of countless slaves were the price paid to fulfill the pharaoh's visions of immortality. Their individual lives and deaths may be unrecorded, but their labor and sacrifice are enshrined forever in each towering monument that endures across the ages along the Nile. As we look upon the pyramids today with wonder and amazement, let us remember too the tragedy and oppression entwined with their creation. The pharaohs and viziers may have commanded their construction, but it was humble men like Taharka and Khnum who truly raised them, stone by back-breaking stone, to touch the heavens while they could only dream of freedom. The smooth white limestone casing stones that once covered the rough, stepped core of the Great Pyramid have long since been stripped away, ravaged by time, the elements, and the hands of men. But for a brief span of decades, the monument gleamed brilliantly under the desert sun, a dazzling testament to the power and prestige of the pharaoh Khufu. Putting those finishing touches on the pyramid was a monumental undertaking in its own right. Thousands of casing blocks, some weighing up to 15 tons, had to be cut and transported from quarries across the Nile. Each block was then painstakingly dressed and polished until the sides were perfectly flat and the edges razor sharp. They fit together with such precision that a knife blade could not be inserted between them. As casing stones gradually sheathed the pyramid from bottom to top, teams of skilled masons worked in concert with the army of laborers. The angle of the blocks had to be continually adjusted to maintain the pyramid's smooth, slightly concave faces as they rose over 480 feet to the apex. It was a feat that required mastery of sophisticated surveying and engineering techniques. While Pharaoh may have delegated this work, he took an intense personal interest in the final stage of construction. The pyramid was far more than just a grandiose tomb. It was the physical embodiment of his divine power and the critical link between his earthly reign and his eternal afterlife. Every element had to be perfect in order to ensure his successful resurrection and ascension to the heavens. This meant the already brutal conditions for the pyramid builders grew even more oppressive as the monument neared completion. Quotas increased, rations decreased, and the threat of harsh punishments loomed constantly as taskmasters sought to avoid the pharaoh's wrath. For many exhausted slaves, this final push would be their last. Merissu had beaten the odds. Through ingenuity, grit, and not a small amount of luck, he'd survived 8 grueling years of labor on Khufu's Great Pyramid. As a stonecutter, his skills made him more valuable than the faceless multitudes hauling blocks. But that was a double-edged sword. His overseers worked him relentlessly, knowing he could not easily be replaced. Still, he took grim satisfaction in seeing the magnificent structure rise to its full height, crowned with an elegant pyramidion of gleaming granite. Merissu had poured his blood, sweat and tears into the stone, and a small, defiant part of him felt that he was building his own legacy, even if the pharaoh would take all the credit for eternity. That satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that he would not be around to see the pyramid complex completed with its sprawling temples, causeways, and boat pits. Those were projects for the months and years ahead, and Merissu's fate, like that of countless other slaves, was already sealed. The telltale cough that racked his lungs grew worse by the day, the result of nearly a decade inhaling stone dust. His body, pushed beyond all natural limits, was finally giving out. He had seen it happen to so many others. A mercifully quick death under a falling block, or a tool-turned weapon in a moment of rebellion, or else the slow wasting away of injury, disease, and despair. Merissu knew he would soon join the many anonymous skeletons already resting in shallow graves around the plateau. Khufu, in contrast, would lie in opulent splendor deep within the heart of the pyramid, surrounded by all the luxuries and treasures he would need in the afterlife. The pharaoh's mummified remains would be sealed in a magnificent sarcophagus of smooth granite, his imperishable vessel for the ages. According to the sacred texts, Khufu's spirit would then rise from his tomb and ascend to the stars, taking his place among the gods in the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Whether he had earned that exalted status through good and just rule or sheer force of will was a question for the gods to decide. As for the slaves who had given their lives to build Khufu's path to immortality, their prospects in the afterlife were far less certain. They had no grand tombs or grave goods to take with them, no scrolls filled with spells and incantations to guide their spirits through the perils of the underworld. At best, their friends and family could offer up humble prayers in their memory, pleading for the mercy of Osiris. Some, like Merissu, took solace in the belief that their dutiful service in building the pyramid would earn them a favored place as servants to the pharaoh in the afterlife, an eternal continuation of their earthly toil. Others simply hoped for the peace of oblivion, an end to the suffering and injustice they had known in life. For all of them, the true afterlife was the one they had already given in service to Khufu's monumental vision. Their back-breaking labor and sacrifice was the immortal foundation upon which the pharaoh's name would endure for over 4,000 years and counting. In that sense, the ghosts of the pyramid builders haunt us to this day. Long after the pharaohs faded into history, the pyramids have remained as timeless icons of human audacity, ingenuity, and industry. They still stand in silent witness to the heights of power and the depths of exploitation, daring us to reckon with the darkness behind the dazzling facades of history. In that reckoning lies an uncomfortable truth that the crowning architectural achievements of our early civilizations, those wonders we hold up as the very measure of human progress, rest upon foundations of immense cruelty and suffering. The broken bodies of slaves are the hidden stones that bear the weight of empires. Yet, this truth should not negate our wonder at the sublime beauty and staggering engineering prowess of the pyramids, or the sophistication of the civilization that built them. The ancient Egyptians grappled with the eternal questions of life, death, power, justice, and the divine, with a depth and artistry that still resonates across the millennia. Their legacy is a complex tapestry woven of the sacred and the profane, and we are still unraveling its meanings and mysteries. With each new discovery and insight, we add another thread to that tapestry, connecting us to the hands that built the pyramids and the minds that dreamed them. Perhaps, in striving to understand the ancient Egyptians in all their brilliance and brutality, we can also learn something of ourselves and the paradoxes of the human condition. For we too are builders of monuments, both glorious and terrible, inheritors of the same desires and fears that shaped the lives of pharaohs and slaves alike so long ago. The pyramids will keep their secrets for eternity, but they will also keep provoking us to ask the questions that define our humanity, about the price of progress, the nature of power, the promise of the afterlife, and the unbreakable bonds of mortality that connect us across the ages. In contemplating their mysteries, we just might find some measure of truth and redemption. As the last rays of the setting sun wash the Great Pyramid in shades of orange and amber, casting long shadows across the plateau, one can almost imagine the legions of laborers taking their leave, their work finally done. In the gathering dusk, their spirits linger still, whispering to us from the silence of stone. The sweltering sun beat down mercilessly on the barren landscape of Giza, baking the earth and the thousands of slaves toiling away in the shadow of the rising pyramid. From a distance, the great structure seemed to shimmer and dance in the haze, a mirage of perfectly cut limestone blocks reaching towards the heavens. But for those laboring at its base, the pyramid loomed as an inescapable monument to their suffering and servitude. The slaves moved in a ceaseless, almost mechanical rhythm, chiseling, hauling, hoisting, stacking. Their muscular bronze bodies glistened with sweat, dust caking into the wounds left by the sting of the overseer's whips. They worked from the first light of dawn until the last of the sun's rays painted the desert sands a deep blood red. Day after day, year after year, generation after generation. Many of these wretched souls had begun their lives far from Egypt, in the hills of Canaan, the plains of Libya, or the lush valleys of Nubia. Torn from their families and homelands, they now belonged to the god-king of Egypt, Pharaoh Khufu. It was he who had ordered the construction of this unprecedented monument, a tomb that would safeguard his body and possessions for all eternity. To realize this grand vision, Khufu's architects and engineers had first set their sights on the Giza Plateau, a limestone outcropping on the western banks of the mighty Nile. The site was ideal, the flat expanse providing ample space and a firm foundation, while the quality of the limestone promised an almost infinite supply of building material. In their mind's eye, they had conceived of a pyramid of monumental proportions, one that would dwarf all those that had come before. But theory was one matter, execution quite another. Before even a single stone could be laid, an immense amount of preparation and marshalling of resources was required. Work gangs were assembled, each under the watchful eye of an overseer, armed with a whip and a steely resolve. Surveyors and scribes meticulously laid out the pyramid's base, ensuring its sides aligned perfectly with the cardinal points of the compass. In the limestone quarries nearby, an army of slaves toiled to extract the raw materials that would form the pyramid's core. With copper chisels, bronze saws, wooden rollers and sleds, they cut and transported the heavy stone blocks to the construction site. The cacophony of their labours reverberated across the desert. The thud of mallets, the scraping of chisels, the rumble of stone against stone, the anguished groans of straining men. Nile boats ferried in other vital supplies when the floodwaters allowed, food and beer to sustain the slaves, finer limestone and granite for the chambers and passageways within the pyramid, even luxury goods like resins and oils to be entombed with the pharaoh for his use in the afterlife. An entire economy revolved around the pyramid's construction. As the first level of stones was laid and the structure began to rise, the real dangers and difficulties of the work became apparent. Broken bones and crushed limbs from tumbling blocks were commonplace. Accidents, illness, and sheer exhaustion claimed lives with distressing regularity. And always, there was the stifling, suffocating heat and the unrelenting lash of the overseer's whips to contend with. Yet still the pyramid climbed inexorably towards the sky, a testament to the technical sophistication of the ancient Egyptian builders and the relentless toil of their slave workforce. With each new level, the ramps used to haul up the stone blocks had to be lengthened and heightened, the logistics of the construction growing ever more complex. For the slaves, life revolved around the punishing labour of the pyramid. When not working, they were crammed into simple mud brick barracks, eking out a meagre existence on rations of flatbread, onions, and the occasional dried fish. Families were a luxury most could ill afford. Disease was rife in these squalid quarters, dysentery and pneumonia oft proving as deadly as any workplace accident. Few could expect to see out their 30th year. Overseeing this organised chaos was the king's most trusted vizier, Hemiunu. A scion of the royal family, Hemiunu was renowned for his keen intellect, his fierce ambition, and his utter ruthlessness in executing the pharaoh's will. The speed and efficiency with which the pyramid took shape was a testament to his administrative brilliance, and the human costs be damned. For Hemiunu, the pyramid was an opportunity to secure his place in history and his position at the right hand of Pharaoh. He pushed the slaves mercilessly, setting ever more daunting quotas for each work gang and publicly flaying alive those overseers who failed to meet them. Production soared even as the wails of agony from the whipping posts became a constant chorus. As the years ground on and the death toll mounted, whispers of rebellion began to stir among the slaves. Some spoke of marching on the palace to demand their freedom, others of sabotaging the pyramid to bury their hated masters under a cascade of limestone. But Hemiunu was always one step ahead, his network of informants ferreting out these pockets of dissent. The ringleaders were rounded up and put to death in the most brutal fashion imaginable, impaled on stakes for all to see, their bowels left for the vultures to feast upon. Hemiunu himself presided over these gruesome spectacles, his cold eyes scanning the assembled slaves as if daring them to even contemplate defiance. The message was clear. There would be no relief, no respite, no escape from their wretched lot, save that offered by death itself. And so the pyramid continued its inexorable rise, as did the tally of lives spent in its construction. The pharaoh made occasional visits to the site, surveying the progress with an impassive eye from beneath his leopard skin cloak and blue war crown. For him, the sight of his monument taking shape must have stirred a deep sense of satisfaction, even as the reality of its construction reflected his utter disregard for the lives of his subjects. As the years stretched into decades, the pyramid neared completion. The last of the outer casing stones, cut from fine white limestone, were polished until they shone like a second sun. The pyramidion, or capstone, was hefted into place upon the apex, gleaming with electrum, an alloy of gold and silver reserved for the pharaoh alone. The full complex of monuments sprang up around the pyramid's base. The mortuary temple for the king's spirit to receive offerings, the valley temple and causeway to host his funeral, the smaller pyramids for his queens, and the mastaba tombs for his officials. An entire necropolis, a city of the dead, had been conjured out of the desert at an incalculable human cost. For the slaves, the completion of the pyramid brought no relief. Some were reassigned to other royal building projects, their bodies broken and spirits shattered. Others, deemed no longer useful, were simply cast aside, left to fend for themselves in a world they barely remembered. The lucky ones found menial work on the estates of nobles. The rest drifted into the wilderness to die. In the end, Pharaoh Khufu did achieve his goal, a monument that would endure for the ages, an eternal stone mountain proclaiming his power and prestige for all time. His mummified body was laid to rest in the heart of the pyramid, surrounded by unimaginable treasures, his spirit embarking on a journey to the afterlife where he would reign as a god forevermore. But for the slaves who labored and died to build this monument, there would be no such glorious immortality. They were buried in simple pit graves, gouged into the desert sands, their bones intermingling with the detritus of the construction, pottery shards, worn-out copper chisels, splinters of wooden rollers. No grand offerings accompanied them, no elaborate spells to ensure their resurrection and eternal sustenance. In the official histories of the reign, in the grandiose inscriptions on the pyramid's walls, their suffering found no mention. They were simply tools, animate but expendable, their pain and despair no more noteworthy than the dullness of a copper chisel or the splitting of a wooden roller. In death, as in life, they were invisible. Yet something of their essence still lingers, etched into the very fabric of the pyramid. An energy born of their blood and sweat and tears, their hopes and dreams and fears. It seeps out from between the immaculately cut stones, whispering of the true cost of the king's immortality. Today, as tourists marvel at the enigmatic majesty of the pyramids, as scholars probe their every angle and alignment for meaning, it is all too easy to forget this essential truth, that these enduring icons of human achievement conceal an even more enduring legacy of human suffering, that every stone, every block, every polished slab is a wordless memorial to a life spent and lost in service of a pharaoh's vanity. In the deserts of ancient Egypt, entire generations lived and died to the relentless rhythm of pyramid construction, an era of unimaginable splendor built on an edifice of unimaginable sorrow. The tragedy of their tale echoes across the millennia, a haunting counterpoint to the towering ambitions of kings. It is a tale that speaks to the eternal tension between the will of the mighty and the woe of the meek, between the heights of human achievement and the depths of human cruelty. A tale as stark and timeless as the pyramids themselves, enduring testaments to the light and shadow of the human condition. And so, the Great Pyramid of Giza stands, as it has for over 4,500 years, a marvel and a memorial in equal measure. As long as its stones endure, so too will the memory of those who toiled and suffered and perished in its shadow, the silent, uncounted multitudes whose lives were the true price of a pharaoh's dream of immortality. The lives of the pyramid builders were brutal and short. They toiled from dawn to dusk in the searing desert heat, hauling massive blocks of stone, cutting and setting them in place with primitive copper chisels. The work was backbreaking, the conditions harsh and unforgiving. The slaves dwelled in cramped, squalid villages that sprung up near the construction sites. Their huts were little more than lean-tos of mud brick and reeds, a far cry from the magnificent monuments they labored to create. Rations were meager, barely enough to sustain them through the punishing workday. A coarse bread formed the staple of their diet, washed down with beer, the only means to make the contaminated Nile water safe to drink. On occasion, their overseers might toss them some salted fish or a few withered vegetables, but meat was a rare luxury. Despite the scalding heat, the men wore little more than loincloths as they worked, their bronzed skin baked and weathered by the relentless sun. Women and children toiled alongside them, struggling under baskets of rubble or mixing the mud and straw for bricks. There was no respite from the taskmaster's whips, no relief from the daily grind of hard labour. Injuries were frequent, medical care non-existent. Men lost fingers, crushed limbs, and even their lives, moving the gargantuan stone blocks into place. Blindness from rock shards was common among the masons and carvers. Malnutrition and disease ran rampant in the close, unsanitary quarters. Dysentery, pneumonia, smallpox, all claimed countless slaves whose broken bodies were unceremoniously buried in shallow desert graves, unmarked and unrecorded. The loss of life was staggering, but to the kings and viziers, it was simply the price to be paid for immortality. The pharaoh, the living god on earth, would stop at nothing to ensure his eternal life after death, no matter how many of his subjects perished in the process. In this sense, the pyramids are not just marvels of engineering, but monuments to the depths of human vanity, hubris, and cruelty. The blood, sweat, and tears of tens of thousands are baked into those mighty stone bricks. One of the most driven and ambitious taskmasters of this era was the vizier Hemiunu, a nephew of the pharaoh Khufu himself. As overseer of Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza, the largest of them all, Hemiunu was utterly ruthless in extracting the maximum labor from his workforce to please the king. The speed and efficiency with which he raised this colossus became legendary, the template for all the Great Pyramids to follow. But that speed came at a terrible human cost. Hemiunu rose from an already privileged position, born into the royal family and educated as a scribe and priest. His natural intelligence and political savvy caught the pharaoh's attention, and he was eventually entrusted with managing not just the Great Pyramid, but all the major construction projects at Giza. It was an immense responsibility, but also an unprecedented opportunity for glory, wealth, and power. Determined to make his mark, Hemiunu drove the slaves mercilessly. He instituted a strict quota system, dictating how many blocks each team of workers had to cut, haul, and set per day. Failure to meet these targets resulted in brutal beatings and deprivation of already meager food and water rations. Troublemakers and underperformers were dealt with harshly as an example to the rest. Hemiunu himself was said to prowl the worksite with a hippo hide whip, doling out lashes to any slave he perceived as lazy or insubordinate. As the years ground on and the Great Pyramid rose ever higher, Hemiunu earned a reputation as a harsh but effective taskmaster, respected and feared in equal measure. The pharaoh showered him with wealth, estates, and honors, cementing his place among the most powerful men in Egypt. In a bid to share in Khufu's promised afterlife, Hemiunu even prepared a magnificent tomb for himself, not far from the foot of the Great Pyramid. Alas, he did not live to occupy it, and his mummy has never been found. But Hemiunu's iron grip on the workforce did not go unchallenged. The suffering of the slaves reached such an extreme that rebellion became inevitable. As the substructure of the pyramid neared completion, the powder keg finally ignited. Maddened by hunger, abuse, and despair, a group of workers banded together and rose up against their overseers, overpowering and slaying several in a frenzied attack. Armed with their construction tools, heavy copper chisels, wooden mallets, quarrying bars, the rebelling slaves ran amok through the Giza plateau, calling for their fellow workers to join them in overthrowing their oppressors. For a moment, it seemed the whole endeavor might collapse into anarchy and bloodshed. But Hemiunu acted swiftly and decisively to restore order. Mustering a force of soldiers, guards, and loyal overseers, the vizier stormed the workers' village and quashed the nascent uprising with savage force. The ringleaders were ferreted out and executed on the spot, their bodies impaled on stakes and left to rot in the sun as a grim warning. The remaining rebels were rounded up and lashed within an inch of their lives, before being chained and hobbled to prevent further insurrection. In the aftermath, Hemiunu tightened his stranglehold even further, imposing additional security measures and harsher disciplinary action at the slightest hint of disobedience. Informers were seeded among the workers to report any whiff of sedition. The shattered slaves, cowed into submission, would never again dare to rise up. The pharaoh's tomb would be built as planned, on the backs of their misery and toil. As the years dragged on and the Great Pyramid neared completion, the aging Hemiunu became ever more anxious to solidify his own position for eternity. He set his sights on preparing his own tomb, a stone mastaba fit for a king, adjacent to Khufu's pyramid. No expense was spared in its construction and adornment, with fine limestone casing, an ornate granite burial chamber, and walls emblazoned with recitations from the sacred pyramid texts to ensure his eternal life. But the strain of managing the pyramid construction had taken its toll on Hemiunu. The once vital, powerfully built man had grown gaunt and stooped, his face lined with care. His temper, never gentle, became explosive and erratic. Slaves whispered that he wandered the construction site at night, muttering incantations and talking to spirits. Some said he had gone mad under the weight of his responsibilities and his own towering ambition. Perhaps it was madness, or perhaps Hemiunu simply worked himself into an early grave. But one evening, after flying into a rage over a perceived error in the alignment of the pyramid's upper blocks, the great vizier collapsed, blood trickling from his mouth and nose. He was rushed to his estate, where the finest physicians and priests attended him, but to no avail. At dawn on the following day, Hemiunu, the mighty overseer of the pyramids, architect of the pharaoh's eternal glory, breathed his last. He had driven himself and his workers to the brink to complete his monumental task, only to perish before he could enjoy its fruits. In the end, the pyramid had devoured its creator, as it had so many of the hopeless souls who slaved to build it. The king declared a national day of mourning and decreed that Hemiunu should be buried with full honors in his mastaba at Giza. But when the time came to inter him, the vizier's body could not be found. Rumors swirled about his uncanny disappearance, that his mausoleum was a decoy, that he had been buried in a hidden chamber within the Great Pyramid itself as a final tribute from Khufu. Darker whispers hinted that the slaves had spirited him away and subjected his corpse to some unspeakable vengeance. The truth would never be known. Despite the most intensive searches of the Giza plateau, Hemiunu's remains were never recovered. It was as if the very sands had swallowed him up, erasing all trace of the man who had orchestrated both the most triumphant achievement and the most appalling atrocity of Egypt's old kingdom. In the end, perhaps it was a fitting denouement for such a driven, ruthless man, an ironic coda to his relentless pursuit of immortality. He had sacrificed everything, including his humanity, to the ideal of the eternal afterlife. But in death, he was denied even the basics of a proper burial. His memory fading into obscurity, his tomb lost to the ages. Like the legions of slaves whose shortened lives he spent in service of Khufu's glory, Hemiunu disappeared into the desolation and anonymity of the desert. With the great overseer gone, it fell to lesser supervisors to put the finishing touches on the pharaoh's monument. The sides of the pyramid were smoothed and covered in gleaming white limestone, polished to a high sheen so that it shone like a second sun on the horizon. The pyramid's apex, formed of a single block of granite, was the last to be placed, capping the whole immense structure with geometric perfection. A complex of temples, courtyards, and shrines arose around the pyramid's base, linked to it by long causeways that radiated out into the desert like spokes of an enormous wheel. Khufu's mortuary temple, where priests would make offerings to his spirit for all eternity, stood tall against the eastern face, welcoming the rising sun each dawn. To the south, the pharaoh's solar barge waited patiently in its sealed pit to carry him across the heavens with the sun, god Ra. Finally, the pharaoh's body was laid to rest in the heart of the pyramid, encased in a sarcophagus of red granite. Interred with him were all the grave goods he would require in the afterlife: golden statues, jewelry, furniture, chests of clothing and linen, jars of food and wine. The chambers were sealed, the passageways blocked with granite portcullises. Khufu was now ready to embark on his final journey, equipped with all the trappings of his divine kingship. But what of the slaves, the legions of men, women and children whose thankless labor had made this marvel possible? For them, there was no grand burial, no promise of eternal life, no reward for their suffering. Most would perish before the pyramid was finished, struck down by illness, injury, or sheer exhaustion. Their broken bodies were interred in simple sand graves on the outskirts of the site, or left to the jackals and vultures in the desert wastes. A lucky few might live to see the finished pyramid in all its radiant glory, but even they would not be spared the ravages of their back-breaking toil. Worn out, crippled, lungs choked with rock dust, they would be discarded by their taskmasters, no longer of use. Some might find a meager livelihood as servants, laborers, or beggars in the city. Others would drift into the wilderness, eking out their days far from the monument that had consumed their youth and strength. The Egyptians had little conception of an afterlife for common folk, much less slaves. That eternal paradise was reserved for the pharaohs and the very elite, who could afford to fill their tombs with all the luxuries and necessities of life. For the pyramid builders, the realm beyond death held only a vague promise of a continued existence, perhaps in the field of reeds, where the blessed dead dwelled. But for most, it was simply a dark, uncertain void. In a sense, though, the slaves achieved a kind of immortality through their work. The pyramids they built have endured for 4,500 years, inspiring and baffling generations who marveled at their sheer scale and audacity. The blood and sweat of those long dead laborers are ingrained in every massive block, every sleek casing stone. Though their names are lost, their monumental efforts have never been forgotten. Today, we look upon the pyramids with admiration, but also with a profound sense of unease. They are testaments to human ingenuity and ambition, but also to the depths of human cruelty and injustice. The sheer magnitude of suffering involved in their creation is almost unimaginable to the modern mind. They stand as troubling reminders of the dark underside of humanity's greatest triumphs. But perhaps that is as it should be. The pyramids, in all their complex, contradictory glory, reflect the civilization that created them. A society capable of extraordinary achievements, breathtaking artistry, and profound intellectual insights, but also one built on a foundation of ruthless hierarchy, unabashed brutality, and the wholesale exploitation of human beings. They are marvels, but also monsters, and that duality is at the core of their enduring fascination. As we drift off to sleep, lulled by these ageless wonders rising eternally from the desert sands, we are left to ponder the dreams of the kings who built them, and the nightmares of the slaves who made them possible. The mysteries locked within those tons of towering stone may never be fully unraveled. But one thing is clear: the cost of the pharaoh's immortality was beyond reckoning, paid in the suffering of countless souls long since lost to the distant past. The pyramids are their memorial, as much as their torment, a haunting, inescapable legacy carved in stone. The Egyptians had an elaborate system of mummifying bodies to preserve them for the afterlife, and the corpse of a pharaoh received the most meticulous treatment. As soon as the king passed, embalmers would swiftly remove his internal organs, except for the heart, and place them in special canopic jars. The heart remained because it was thought to be the seat of wisdom and would be needed for final judgment in the afterlife. The body was then carefully washed, dried, and packed with natron salt to desiccate it, a process that could take up to 70 days. During this time, priests would recite prayers and spells to protect the body and help guide the pharaoh's spirit into the underworld. Once thoroughly dried, the body was anointed with sacred oils and resins, then painstakingly wrapped in hundreds of yards of fine linen bandages. Protective amulets were placed between the layers, while the embalmers softly chanted incantations. A lifelike death mask, often made of gold, was fitted over the pharaoh's face. The iconic crossed arms and regal headdress gave the pharaoh an aura of serene power, as if merely sleeping, ready to awaken and rule again in the next world. This mummy was then nestled within a series of nested coffins, each more splendid than the last. The outermost was a massive granite sarcophagus, exquisitely carved with symbols and texts to safeguard the pharaoh's eternal slumber. With great ceremony, the sarcophagus was conveyed into the pyramid's shadowy burial chamber. There, surrounded by all the worldly riches deemed necessary for the afterlife, glittering jewelry, fine furniture, ornate statuary, even mummified pets. The god king was sealed away, unperturbed by the passage of the ages, awaiting his final journey through the underworld and into immortality. While the pharaoh luxuriated in his eternal peace, the pyramid complex hummed with activity long after his departure from the earthly realm. A permanent staff of priests, administrators, and servants occupied the temples, performing the daily rituals and presenting the lavish offerings that sustained the dead king's spirit. Processions arrived regularly with tributes from across the land to keep the temples well stocked. Cattle were slaughtered, incense burned, and prayers recited without cease. All this busy devotion was funded by the produce of great agricultural estates, established during the pharaoh's reign for his perpetual upkeep. For those toiling in the fields of these estates, life went on much as it had for generations, dictated by the rhythms of the Nile. They planted their crops in the rich silt left behind after the yearly inundation, tended them under the blazing sun, and harvested the bounty to fill not just their own bellies, but the storehouses of their immortal lord. Most could only dream of an afterlife of ease, but took some solace in knowing their pious efforts would be looked upon favorably by the gods. For the slaves who had labored and perished building the pyramid, there would be no grand send-off into eternity. They were buried simply, without pomp or treasure, in shallow graves near the monument they had struggled so mightily to raise. If lucky, family or friends would leave some humble offering, a cup, a crude figurine, a scrap of food, to provision them in the beyond. Some believed that having served the pharaoh so faithfully in life, they might be permitted a place as his eternal servant in the celestial court. Others surely cursed their bitter fate and prayed for a kinder lot in the next life. As the generations marched on, the Great Pyramid stood watch over an ever-changing Egypt. New pharaohs, new gods, new ways came and went under their long shadow. The sacred landscape grew ever more crowded with tombs and temples. Shifting sands slowly swallowed abandoned monuments, erasing the names of both the mighty and the meek. But the pyramids endured, defying time, still piercing the vault of heaven as they had for eons. Though their outer veneers crumbled, their inner halls were looted, and the meaning of their texts was lost. Still, they spoke wordlessly of the immense power that had called them into being, and the nameless thousands who had made it possible. We who look upon them today cannot help but marvel at their colossal scale, their mathematical precision, their sheer audacity, the way they seem to transcend the limits of human endeavor. It is easy to be swept up in romanticism, to imagine the glory and grandeur of the world that bred them. But we must also remember the darker story they tell, a story of exploitation, of oppression, of lives ground to dust beneath the wheels of unchecked ambition. The pyramids are not just triumphs of engineering, but testaments to the depths of human suffering. In a sense, those forgotten slaves are still with us, in every block of stone, in every soaring line of the pyramid's profile. Their monumentality is also their memorial, an imperishable reminder of the labor, the injustice, the sorrow that too often lurks behind the supposed wonders of the world. If we listen closely, we can hear their voices whispering across the ages, urging us to look beyond the beautiful facade, to remember the ugly truths, to build our own monuments on foundations of compassion, equity, and shared humanity. Only then, perhaps, can we raise marvels that truly uplift the spirit, that unite rather than divide, that serve not as tombs, but as beacons lighting the way to a brighter future for all. So let us gaze upon the pyramids with both awe and humility. Let us celebrate the ingenuity and determination of those who built them, while also mourning the pain and injustice they represent. And let us carry their hard-won lessons forward, striving always to shape a world where such wonders are born not from bondage, but from common purpose and the free flowering of the human spirit. In this way, we may yet redeem the sufferings of the past and craft a legacy that will endure not as cold stone, but as a living flame of hope, justice, and brotherhood. The life of a pyramid builder was one of endless toil, but the work did not end with death. The ancient Egyptians held strong beliefs about the afterlife, and for the pharaohs, preparing for the next world was of utmost importance. Deep within the pyramids, lavish burial chambers were constructed to house the pharaoh's mummified remains and all the treasures and provisions they would need to enjoy a comfortable afterlife. No expense was spared in outfitting these chambers with gold, jewels, furniture, clothing, food, and drink. But what of the slaves who labored and perished to build these grand tombs? Their burials were far more humble. Most were laid to rest in simple, shallow graves dug into the sand near the pyramid site. A few modest possessions or scraps of food might be included if they were lucky. For most slaves, there was no mummification, no protective coffin, no inscriptions to ensure safe passage to the afterlife. Just a shroud of linen and an unmarked resting place near the monument that consumed their lives. Some beliefs held that the slaves might still find favor in the afterlife for their role in building these temples to the gods. Perhaps, it was thought, their pious labor would be looked upon kindly by Osiris, the god of the underworld. Maybe their toil and sacrifice in this world would grant them a measure of peace and rest in the next. But such comforts were far from guaranteed. For the pharaohs, in contrast, a glorious and well-provisioned afterlife was assumed. The pyramids were designed not only as remarkable feats of engineering and symbols of power, but as resurrection machines. Every element was imbued with symbolism to ensure the pharaoh's eternal life. The pyramid's smooth, gleaming white limestone surface was thought to radiate light like the sun god Ra. Its shape represented the first mound of earth to emerge from the primordial waters at the moment of creation. Inside, winding passages were believed to mirror the pharaoh's journey through the underworld, facing obstacles and judgment before emerging triumphant into the sky. There, the pharaoh would take his place among the eternal stars, sailing across the heavens with the sun god in his solar boat. Or so it was hoped, based on an elaborate understanding of how the cosmic order aligned with the Egyptian kings. But maintaining that order was not the pharaoh's job alone. A vast priestly class was tasked with performing the daily rituals and recitations needed to keep the cycle of life turning. This meant a never-ending stream of food offerings, incense burning, and chants within the pyramid temples to invoke the gods' favor. And so, even in the afterlife, the pharaohs required a legion of servants continuing to work on their behalf. The story of the pyramids, then, is a complex one. A story of remarkable ingenuity, ambition, and skill, but also one of exploitation, suffering, and stark inequality. These monuments that have captured imaginations for millennia are a testament to the heights of human achievement, but also to the capacity of the powerful to extract an immense toll from the many to glorify the few. It is a deeply uncomfortable reality to confront as we stand in awe before the majestic pyramids today. To think of the blood, sweat, and tears that were poured into the foundations, the cries of pain and grief that echoed in the desert air as lives were spent in service of a vision not their own. It brings a profound humility, a reckoning with the sacrifices and injustice that can lurk behind even our most celebrated triumphs. And yet, the story of the pyramids also speaks to something deeply resilient in the human spirit. The desire to leave a mark, to strive for something larger than ourselves, to reach for the eternal no matter the hardship. It is a very human impulse, one that has driven us to incredible feats across the ages, from the Great Wall to the Apollo missions. But perhaps, as we reflect on the troubling shadows cast by the pyramids, we can also find inspiration to build new monuments, ones born not of conquest and coercion, but of shared purpose and common good. Imagine what marvels we might create if we harnessed our collective ingenuity and labor in a spirit of cooperation rather than exploitation. It's a vision to carry forward as we contemplate these ancient wonders. As we come to the end of our journey into the lives of the pyramid builders, I invite you to sit with these complexities for a moment, to honor the skill and perseverance of the many hands that made these monuments possible, while also reckoning honestly with the injustice and tragedy of their conditions. It is a somber note to end on, perhaps, but one that feels vital to acknowledging. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of history's most fascinating and troubling chapters. I hope it has given you a new perspective on these eternal monuments and the very human stories behind them. With that, I'll bid you a restful good night. And if you enjoyed this dive into the past, I'd be grateful if you gave a quiet click of the like button and subscribed for more meandering journeys through the captivating, complicated annals of history. Until next time, sweet dreams.